Welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. So, somewhat late start today. There's kind of a late breaking news. We have a new commander of Russian land forces who just been appointed, Lieutenant General Andrei Mordvichev, and obviously trying to find out a little more about it. And and then there's an interesting story here from. Let me read this out to you. This is it's quoted. It's in RT, but it's quoting Bloomberg, and it says that the U.S. has proposed resuming long-stalled security talks under the NATO-Russian Council framework as part of efforts to negotiate a peace deal in the Ukraine conflict. So there's a long-stalled security talks under the NATO-Russia Council. The report comes ahead of direct negotiations between Russia and Ukrainian delegation. The NATO-Russia Council, a forum created in 2002 for dialogue between the US-led military bloc and Moscow, effectively ceased practical operations in 2014. That year, Crimea joined the Russian Federation, and then the US has reportedly offered to revive the NATO-Russia Council format as part of its efforts to talk Russia into freezing the Ukraine conflict. Last month, White House Special Envoy Steve Witkoff visited Moscow and reportedly attempted to persuade Russian President Vladimir Putin to agree to a ceasefire that would suspend fighting. So the reason why this is interesting, and here just quoting from the Bloomberg article, the U.S. has since added new details to the proposals, including an offer for this revival, and blah blah. No. So it's an interesting play because Russia obviously. Yeah, all right. We'll get to that later. Russia obviously, as one of its demands, has been the revival of some kind of a the, security conference, a kind of a global security conference, or at least a continental-wide security conference involving NATO, involving Russia, and because essentially Russia needs its long-term security concerns addressed. And that was obviously one of the aspects of what Lavrov, whenever he talks about the root causes of the war in the Ukraine, there were a number of root causes that he lists, but one of them is obviously NATO membership for Ukraine, but another one is the need for some kind of a security arrangement and to ensure that NATO does not continue to expand eastward and NATO does not continue to threaten Russian security. So this talk of of a revival of a kind of NATO-Russia security talks, which has been in abeyance since 2014, is a step in that direction. So it's clear that somehow the Americans realize that we're not going to be able to get anywhere with these negotiations until we address Russia's security concerns. So I think that's an interesting development. Now, going back to the developments of the day. This seems to be this was a late break. There's two late breaking stories. This change in the leadership, the military leadership at the top in Russia, which I think we'll get a better sense of what the significance of that is. And then this offer from the United States, which is clear that the United States again is distancing itself from Europe. And this is really what's been going on. We've had this, um, I think I would have to say it's fake news. It's the very essence, the very pure essence of fake news, um, namely that somehow um, there were these scheduled talks to take place in Istanbul between Putin and Zelensky, and that Putin wasn't going to show up. And because Putin wasn't going to show up, therefore, would be incumbent upon the Trump administration to impose sanctions on Russia and to join the Europeans in demanding this unconditional 30-day ceasefire. Now, this is the very classic definition of fake news. In other words, the media are simply making up news in order to fit their agenda. I mean, I need hardly remind you of the sequence of events. We had the coalition of the willing um, going to Ukraine over the weekend and doing the usual thing of insisting, absolutely insisting that Russia agreed to an unconditional, the 30-day ceasefire, and if it doesn't, um, sanctions, another round of sanctions will be imposed on Russia, and insisting that President Trump is on board with this demand. Now, at that very moment, and I've already pointed this out several times, but it needs to be repeated precisely because of the abundance of fake news. It needs to be repeated that Trump had sent out a truth that day, that very day, saying ideally there will be a 30-day ceasefire. And then once the ceasefire is in place, whoever violates the ceasefire will be subjected to sanctions. So it's ideally, and then once the ceasefire is in place, whoever violates it will be subjected to sanctions. So it's very, very different from the way the media presented it, which is that Trump had joined the demand for a 30-day ceasefire and declared that anyone who that if Russia fails to agree to this 30-day ceasefire, Russia will be subjected to sanctions. It's not what Trump said. That's what the Europeans said. And that's what the Europeans want you to think Trump said. But Trump explicitly, you just read the truth, did not say that. But in any case, so that was the demand on Saturday, and then on late Saturday night, Sunday morning, very early in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, Sunday time, Putin made this offer of direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine to begin on May the 5th in Istanbul and to be a continuation of the Istanbul negotiations that had been aborted in April of 2022. Now, Trump then sent out a truth expressing great delight over this development, and instructed Zelensky that he should agree to take part in these direct negotiations. He didn't say that Zelensky should go personally, but that's what Zelensky did. Zelensky declared he was going to go personally, and then the story was catapulted by the media, the suggestion that somehow there was going to be a one-on-one meeting between Putin and Zelensky, and that Putin was uh, uh, chickening out, didn't really want to go, and then and somehow this was proof. This is the absolute proof that was needed to demonstrate that Russia had no interest in a settlement of the war. And so ever since Sunday, we've been had this fake news. Absolutely, this is a complete fraud, total fraud. That Putin had somehow said he was going to show up in Istanbul, and now Putin was having second thoughts or was chickening out, and that was now this was proof. This is, hey, President Trump, this is the proof you were looking for, that Russia's not serious about negotiations. So look, he's not showing up. You have to join the Europeans. You have to join the coalition of the willing and impose sanctions on Russia. Look at them. They're not interested in peace. And so this has been going on and on and on since Sunday. As I say, it's totally fake news because the media made the story up. First of all, Putin did not say on Sunday that he would be showing up in Istanbul. And the reason he said he didn't say he would show up is that in any negotiations, they start off at the very basic level, at the level of negotiators. And then, if there's progress, if it seems like these negotiations are heading in a positive direction, then more senior level officials join in. A president, a head of state, only joins in at the very last stage of the talks. This is just so basic that it's kind of childish even having to spell this out. During the peace talks over Vietnam, and let's remember that the peace talks in Vietnam began in Paris in 1968. In 1968, and they concluded with the signing of the Paris Accords in 1963. Throughout from 1968 through to 1973, Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, they didn't show up in Paris. This was at the level of negotiators. Then, towards the end of 1972, when it was clear that they were really very close to an agreement, that's when Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor, that's when he flew to Paris and took over the negotiations. But you don't have presidents coming in and taking over the negotiations. And if one looks back on the Minsk talks, starting in February 2022, and then the continuation of these talks in Istanbul, Putin was not there, nor was Lavrov there. This was at a very rudimentary level. Zelensky wasn't there. No one expected Zelensky to be there at these talks. But now, again, as I say, the media have pretended that somehow there was some commitment on Putin's part to show up personally. As I say, this is wholly made up, and made up for a very pernicious reason. It was made up in order to push the United States into escalating its involvement in Ukraine and push the United States into joining forces with the coalition of the willing, the Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, Friedrich Merz, and Donald Tusk, and the rest of them. That's the goal, because Trump has so far been distancing himself. And as I said, the story from Bloomberg that I just read out shows again Trump distancing himself, because he's now urging the opening of some of the NATO-Russia dialogue as a way of addressing mutual security concerns. So that's exactly what Russia's been looking for, and it's obviously highly, very explicitly, Trump is distancing himself from the Europeans. Now, today, as it became apparent after all the hoopla, because Zelensky flew into Turkey, he showed up, met Erdogan, then he showed up at this NATO meeting, another one is NATO foreign ministers meeting. And so it became clear that, the Russians announced their negotiating team um, uh, yesterday evening, and it's very close to the negotiating team that was doing the negotiating in Minsk in 2022. It was the same man is head of the team, and so it was very much the same guys who were there in 2022. And that's why, and that's what Putin said. This will be a continuation of those negotiations that were aborted by the Ukraine NATO side. And so it became clear that during the day, I mean, you didn't have to be a genius to see, it was been obvious really since last Sunday, Putin was not going to show up. He never said he was going to show up. There was no expectation, whatever, that he was going to show up. But there was some talk that, because Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, it was in Turkey to attend this NATO foreign ministers meeting, that somehow Rubio would go to these talks and whatever. I mean, he'd preside over them, or he would lend a helping hand, or whatever. He was somehow he would involve himself in these talks. Um, but then Trump, uh, um, sometime today, made a very interesting comment, and let's watch what he said today apropos of these negotiations. Let's see if we can get it.
Mr. President, are you disappointed in the level of the delegation that the Russians sent to Turkey?
So that's it. Are you disappointed in the level of the delegation that the Russians sent? Putin had said it's going to be a continuation of the talks in Istanbul. And what do you know? He's sending the same person who headed the Istanbul talks to Istanbul. Are you disappointed? Now, watch Trump's answer.
I don't know anything about it. I'm not disappointed in anything. Who are you from?
BBC News.
I'm not disappointed. What would I be We just took in $4 trillion, and he says, "Are you disappointed about a delegation?" I know nothing about a delegation. I haven't even checked. Look, nothing's going to happen until Putin and I get together. Okay? And obviously, he wasn't going to go. He was going to go, but he thought I was going to go. He wasn't going if I wasn't there, and I don't believe anything's going to happen, whether you like it or not, until he and I get together. But we're going to have to get it solved because too many people are dying. Thank you.
So here he says nothing is going to happen until Putin and I get together. So much again the fake news. Will he? Won't he? Putin is playing a cat and mouse game as to whether he's going to show up or not. Putin. I mean, Trump says something like, "Oh, he was going to show up because he thought I was going to show up." There was never any indication that Putin ever intended to attend in person in Istanbul. But it's significant here that Trump now says that nothing is going to happen in Ukraine until there is a one-on-one meeting between Trump and Putin. Now that's that may or may not be true, because I think the Russians are definitely open to a one-on-one meeting with Trump, and they have been. but I think it would be much more along the lines of um, addressing wider security issues, and that may, I mean, I'm not discounting it. That may be a way of bringing uh, this war to an end. As I said, this news from Bloomberg indicates that the Trump administration is thinking along the lines of what will it take to bring it to an end? What are Russia's security concerns? And by saying we're going to have to open up this NATO-Russia security dialogue, that's all. I mean, that's it. You're already accepting that Russia has these serious security concerns, and that NATO, in continuing to ignore them, and NATO in continuing to ignore them since 2014, has actually um, jeopardized the security of Europe. So there is an opening here, if there's the one-on-one meeting, and as Peter and I have said, and we don't have to be geniuses there. The Russians themselves pointed this out back in December 2021 when Putin addressed those two draft agreements, one for the United States, one for NATO, which were in effect a kind of a Helsinki 2.0, a kind of the draft for a new European security architecture to ensure that nobody feels threatened, nobody's security is is jeopardized. In other words, NATO cannot just go on expanding indefinitely right up to Russia's borders, stationing its forces, its missiles on Russia's borders, and think that that's okay because they're going to go around claiming that they're a defensive alliance and therefore they can't possibly be threatening to anyone. So that's just simply not on. And by this news that I read out from Bloomberg indicates that the Trump administration realizes that they're going to have to address wider security issues, and that's something that could come up in a one-on-one meeting between Putin and Trump. How that translates into developments on the field, we don't know. I mean, but it may well be that Trump will agree to a number uh, of Russia's requirements. We know what the Russia's requirements are. Absolutely no membership of NATO on the part of Ukraine. So Ukraine would have to change its constitution and say that it will be a neutral state. It will not join any military alliances. So that would be one thing. And there would have to be severe uh, restrictions on the size of Ukraine's armed forces, on the presence of foreign military forces in Ukraine. So that could be done. Where I think there'll be difficulties, I've said this before, would be withdrawing Ukrainian forces from the oblasts, because there's no reason for it. I mean, Trump's view would be, hey, well, if Russia hasn't accomplished this through its military, why should we do this for Russia? We can address Russia's security concerns, but we're not going to ask the Ukrainians to withdraw their forces from their own country if Russia isn't strong enough to push Ukrainian forces out by themselves. So I think that's where it's going to be difficult. But as I said before, I don't think it's an insuperable problem, because this hasn't been it's not a territorial war. If we go through the history of Russia's policy towards Ukraine, let's remember, I mean, Putin has expressed displeasure, to the fact that the Bolsheviks had assigned the Donbass to Ukraine, which was basically Russian inhabited. They shoved it into Ukraine, and however, he was part of Ukraine. He was part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and then he was part of Ukraine following the dissolution of the USSR, and Russia really didn't do anything much about it. And even after the Maidan putsch, and Russia's and basically the rejection within the Donbass of the putsch, and then the attempt which was followed by the attempt of the Kiev regime to crush the rebellion in the Donbass, which is the moment when the Russians intervened to protect the people of the Donbass. Even then, Russia made no claims that these territories were part of the Russian Federation. They made no such claims. From 2014 all the way through to 2022, Russia never made any claims that these were integral part of the Russian Federation. Let alone Kherson and Zaporozhye. That only came in September 2022. So if Russia was able to live with the Minsk process, the Minsk process from 2014 to 2022, and the Minsk process, remember, it was about integrating the provinces of the Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk, integrating them within Ukraine. It was not about integrating them within the Russian Federation. So if Putin was willing to do that, all he wanted was a constitutional change, that they would have a special status within Ukraine. It's hard to see that this is somehow absolutely unalterable, unmovable objective on the part of the what the Russians insist on. So that's why I think it could be negotiated, and something along the line. I mean, if other issues are addressed, if security issues are addressed, if NATO issues are addressed, if the treatment of Russian speakers within Ukraine are addressed, then it might well be possible to draw the lines of contact or lines of control within the oblast, and so in other words, Russia hasn't taken full control of them. So I think that could be done, but it can only be done if those other security concerns are addressed. Anyway, so going back to Trump. So Trump made this announcement, so nothing really is going to happen until Putin and I meet, and then Marco Rubio, where are we? Yeah, Marco Rubio held a news conference, and let's see what happened there.
First of all, I'll be meeting tomorrow with the Foreign Minister Fidan and a Ukrainian delegation, a senior delegation from Ukraine that'll be in town. And so I'll meet with them. Someone from our team will be involved in the Russia talks. They sent a more lower level group over here. I hope that those talks will be between Ukraine and Russia, with our Turkish counterparts in the room, along with someone from our team or members of our team at the appropriate level. But I want to be frank, I don't think we don't have high expectations of what will happen tomorrow. And frankly, at this point, I think it's abundantly clear that the only way we're going to have a breakthrough here is between President Trump and President Putin. It's going to require that level of engagement to have a breakthrough in this matter. I don't think anything productive is actually going to happen from this point forward until they engage in a very frank and direct conversation, which I know President Trump is willing to do.
Do you think that might explosive?
Well, the president is impatient to end this war. He's impatient, as he's been clearly said that something needs to happen soon. Too many people are dying. There's too much destruction. And I think he's ready to have that engagement and determine once and for all if there's a path forward and what that path is. And it's my assessment that I don't think we're going to have a breakthrough here until the president and President Putin interact directly on this topic.
I mean, it was 2.5 weeks now since you said that there wasn't concrete progress that you would, and you said at the time now that you would withdraw as mediators.
Well, we haven't been chasing this around the world anymore. I mean, that's already happened. We came because we were told that I was going to be here anyways, obviously, but we came because we were told that there might be a direct engagement between the Russians and the Ukrainians. That was originally the plan. You all heard the same thing. That was not to be the case, or if it is, it's not at the levels we had hoped it would be at. I hope I'm wrong. I hope they have tremendous breakthrough tomorrow if they talk. But I frankly do not believe that we're going to have a breakthrough here until President Trump sits face to face with President Putin and determines what his intentions are moving forward. What I can say with certainty is that the president's he's willing to stick with us as long as it takes to achieve peace. What we cannot do, however, is continue to fly all over the world and engage in meetings that are not going to be productive. Again, I was scheduled to be here anyways because of the NATO summit, and so it just wound up working out that way. But the only way we're going to have a breakthrough here is with President Trump sitting face to face with President Putin and determining once and for all whether there's a path to peace, and if so, what it is.
So, Mr. Secretary, I don't mean to be glib, but if that's the case, if there isn't going to be any breakthrough or any, is there any progress that you can make tomorrow, or otherwise, what's the point from your point?
We would hope so. Again, the level of team that was sent by the Russian side is certainly not indicative of one that's going to lead to a major breakthrough. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm 100% wrong. I hope tomorrow the news says they've agreed to a ceasefire. They've agreed to enter serious negotiations. But I'm just giving you my assessment, honestly. I don't think it's going to lead to that just because of the structure and how this is all played out. I think the next thing that has to happen here for there to be a breakthrough, if there's going to be one, is going to involve President Trump's direct involvement. And I believe the president shares my assessment.
Accept this meeting with President Putin. What is your definition of what happened since then? And how did we end up from having Zelensky Trump and Zelensky Putin meeting to actually expecting Trump Putin meeting?
Well, again, it's not expecting. It's my assessment, which I think the president shares, that the only one who can break this logjam at this point, if it can be broken, is President Trump. He just wants to end the war. He doesn't care who gets the credit for it. He doesn't care who went first. He wants the war to end. He outlined this in his speech a couple of nights ago, where he talked about the fact that he hopes to live in a world where we are building, not destroying. And so that's what he's trying to do here, is achieve peace. At the end, we all have to remember that this is the goal here. The goal here is not to claim victory one side over the other or to gloat about who outmaneuvered who. The goal here is to end a conflict where everyday people are dying. And the longer it takes to end this war, the more people will die. This war will eventually end with a negotiated settlement. It will not end with a military solution. The problem is that every day that goes by and the longer it takes, the more people will die and the more destruction there's going to be. And that's what he's motivated by, 100% entirely motivated by bringing about peace. And that's what we endeavor to do here. And so it's my view, which I think the president has publicly shared as well. It's his view, I should say, which I share, that the only way we're going to get a breakthrough at this point after what's happened here is for the president to directly engage, probably at a personal level, and determine once and for all what it is.
All right. So you can see here that what happened here? Let's see. Oh, the camera's closed down. Okay. I hope everyone could see. So here you got this Rubio, who's saying obviously what Trump said, which is that this isn't going to be settled until there is a meeting between President Putin and President Trump, and the meeting that they're going to have. I mean, obviously Rubio didn't spell it out. It's going to be at a very major level. They're going to have to discuss the entirety of the European security architecture. And I think that's why this story from Bloomberg is, I think, is so important, that the Americans have now put this forward. This is quite dramatic. Put this forward, that the NATO Russia Council, Defense Council, needs to go into operation. In other words, NATO is going to have to address Russia's security concerns, and that's all Russia has been doing. This is 2014. This has been in abeyance since 2014. And so the fact that the Trump administration is putting this forward indicates that the Trump administration understands this and understands what has to happen in order for there to be any kind of an agreement. And I think that's why it's so important. And Rubio is obviously just simply repeating what Trump has said, but Trump's intervention was crucial. He could have just simply said, "Oh yeah, well, okay, well, I'm going to re-examine this. Maybe Putin really is just dragging this out. Well, I'm going to look at it. And so I was hoping that Putin would show up and so on." He said, "No, nothing much is going to happen until Putin and I meet." And look, I mean, this is, it's obviously at this stage now that a meeting between Trump and Putin would be far more substantive than, I mean, Trump was talking early on, I think back in January, that he'd like a meeting with Putin. But now, I mean, it's good with some time has elapsed. There's already now some substance here. There's going to be substance as to what they're going to discuss, and I have to think that by putting this forward, he told the press aboard aboard Air Force One, and then you have Rubio essentially repeating it, that there's clearly plans being made for such a meeting. Trump wouldn't let me just throw this out. He said there would have to be a meeting, and that's the only way that there's going to be any kind of breakthrough. And so I think it's a very interesting development, and the media totally missed the story, completely missed it with this absolute nonsense. Like, oh, Putin's playing a cat and mouse game. Oh, will he show up? Won't he show up? Oh, well, he's clearly just giving us the runaround. He said he was going to show, and now he's not going to show. Absolute nonsense. Absolute total nonsense. Putin never said he was going to show up. There was never any plan to show up. And now, and Trump realizes. Trump absolutely says there was never any plan for Putin to show up, and that not that these negotiations aren't going to go very far. And really the only way of resolving this is at the level of a meeting between America and Russia, and which would have to address the big concern. So that's one thing. The other big story of the day is, I guess, the hearings in the U.S. Supreme Court today on the issue of birthright citizenship. And again, of course, the media presenting, this is so outrageous on the part of Trump. It's true that they're not actually getting to the substance of the issue of the birthright citizenship. They're actually only discussing the issue of the legitimacy of the of these nationwide injunctions issued by district courts, and as we know, these district courts just simply have now taken it upon themselves to be presidents. Every judge gets to be the president of the United States, and then he doesn't like a policy, issues a nationwide injunction, and then the policy just cannot go forward. I mean, that's it. The president, he wins an election, he tries to pursue a policy, and then the judge said, no, that's it. Yeah, I don't like it, and my writ applies nationally. So that's the issue that they're going to address, at least at this stage. And I think that this is kind of important because Chief Justice Roberts has to realize that the judicial system is really becoming quite discredited. I mean, you can't really have judges ruling from the bench. I mean, remember there was a time when we had complaints that the Supreme Court was just simply ruling and overriding the will of elected leaders. But that at least was the Supreme Court. I mean, people used to complain about the Warren Court and so on. Well, hey, the Warren Court is overriding elected leaders, but that's not really now you got just every single district court judge can apparently just simply say, well, I don't like this policy, and like birthright citizenship, or I don't think Trump can liquidate this agency. I don't think Trump can fire all these people, and I'm just going to stop it. That's it. So the president, who is supposedly the head of the executive branch, apparently he's junior to any district court judge. Apparently, every district court judge has seniority over the head of the executive branch. The chief law enforcement officer. So that's the issue that they will address. But of course, it's been that issue of birthright citizenship has been a nonsense. I mean, you can't really have a situation where tourists come into the country and then they give birth, and then automatically, the results of the birth become citizens of the country. So they enjoy all of the perks and privileges of American citizenship, let alone people who are in the country illegally, who have broken into the country, but apparently they can give birth, and then that the result is an American citizen. So you basically are rewarding people for illegality. I mean, in that case, you rewarding people for a crime. Oh, that's good. That was a good idea. You're breaking into the country. Now you've got an American citizen on your hands. So, I mean, it was obviously a complete misinterpretation of what the 14th Amendment said. I've said this before, and I don't need to go into the great length. The 14th Amendment referred to the freed slaves. The freed slaves, essentially, who had been born in the United States, but who, because of the Dred Scott decision, had been deemed not to be citizens of the United States. So now the 14th Amendment said that they were born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction of the government of the United States, which is what they are, obviously, then become citizens of the United States. So it was a way of dealing with the problem of the freed slaves. So the freed slaves that were born in the United States, and so now they had become citizens of the United States, and that's why they put that phrase in, that and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. In other words, if you were born here, born as a slave, you were subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. government. Now, this obviously doesn't apply to tourists. I mean, if you're a citizen of another country, you're not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. You're subject to the jurisdiction of the country of which you are a citizen. And least of all does this apply to illegals who are in the country without the government even knowing that they're in the country, because, of course, if the government knew that they were in the country, then the government would have thrown them out. So it's clear that this has been an absurd misinterpretation, a deliberate misinterpretation of the 14th Amendment, and so but unfortunately, I think it's not being addressed by the court. However, it's it's important if the justices do come to address the issue of these nationwide injunction, because I think that that's becoming the most important issue now, which is that somehow the America is becoming ungovernable, whereby every single uh, district court judge, just a lowly judge, whose qualifications to be a judge is isn't terribly impressive, gets to be president. Anyway, let's take a look at our locals page. Where this is where our locals contributors put money into the ferocious hounds tip jar, because they know how angry the hounds get when there isn't enough in the tip jar. So thank you everybody who's contributed. And Robert, always good to hear from you, Robert. Chow from New Jersey, where the air traffic control system dates from the 1970s, and some of our zoning laws predate color TVs. So color TV, I guess when color TV, I think it was 1968. The color TV was introduced. Yeah, okay. So zoning laws predate 1968. Yeah. It's I mean, it's funny that does seem like a long time ago, but at the same time, it's not that long ago. I mean, 1968. That's about what 57 years ago, which is a long time ago, but not super long time. It's not like the 18th century. But when you say it predates color TV, then that really sounds wow. Was there anything before color TV? You have to be quite old now to remember life before color TV. Anyway, March 2023 says, George, you were disingenuous quoting the Gutter Financial Times regarding Gutter. The Financial Times is Gutter. Regarding the Chinese asking for trade talks, the same George that falsely accuses me of watching mainstream gutter media. The Chinese did not ask for talks, and you know that. Just admit the surplus country China won, just as America has won on its trade agreements with the UK, America being the surplus country. No, I don't admit anything of the sort. I think that it's clear it was from that Financial Times article that the initiative for a meeting between the Chinese and the Americans came from the Chinese. It was the Chinese who went to see Besant in the Treasury. I mean, if the Chinese didn't want to talk to the Americans, they didn't have to talk to the Americans. They didn't have to go to the Treasury and talk to Besant. The Chinese haven't won anything. I mean, trade talks are a long process. You recall there was a long process of the trade talks between Trump and the Chinese during his first term. It went on for quite a while. There was an agreement, and the Chinese notoriously didn't adhere to the agreement. They made all sorts of promises to Trump about the vast purchases that they were going to make, how they were going to open up their market to American products. They didn't really fulfill any of those promises. And that kind of created the problems for Trump's second term, namely that the Chinese didn't come through on their promises. Now, I've said this now many times, and I'll say it again. China, one can compliment China for all sorts of things. I mean, they've accomplished a great deal since the heyday of the Cultural Revolution, which is now about 50 years ago. So it's not even that long ago, the absolute lunacy of the Cultural Revolution. and before that, the lunacy of the Great Leap Forward, and before that, the lunacy of the collectivization of agriculture. It was even more loony in China than the Soviet collectivization of agriculture. So China has recovered from that, even though it's the same group of people who are running China, who ran China during those loony times. But they've done quite well since then. However, um, China is something like number 75 in the world per capita GDP. So in other words, China is a very poor country. That's a measure of whether you're a rich country or not. So if you're a per capita GDP, it is number 75 in the world. And you're sort of running these huge trade surpluses, and you're trying to essentially knock out the United States as a major economic power, then you can't be surprised that other countries are going to take objection to it, because the way the trading system is supposed to work is that everybody's supposed to import and everybody's supposed to export. That way, trade is in balance. When trade is out of balance, then other countries take objection to it. China's problem is that it just basically was expecting the United States or anybody else simply to put up with this indefinitely. It doesn't happen like that. You can't just keep running this massive trade surplus and keep your own consumption level, keep your own standard of living level at a very low level. Because then other countries will realize, hey, you're pursuing a strategy of undermining our economies. You don't open your market up to our goods, but you expect our markets to be open to your goods. We're not going to tolerate this indefinitely. And so when you're running a surplus and your entire economic model depends on the surplus, depends on access to others' markets, then don't be surprised if other countries say, you can't get into our markets anymore. We've had enough. And I think that's really the problem for China. Now, first of all, the tariffs are still in place. There's a 30% tariff that the Americans have retained against China. China has only 10% tariffs against the United States. But there's now a process of negotiations, 90 days of negotiations. If these negotiations do not go well, I would imagine there'll be additional tariffs. So it's just, it's whenever this idea of the trade surplus. Other countries have tried that. That somehow we can just run these surpluses and no one's going to notice, and we can just do it. We can just simply strategically take out other countries' industries, and no one's going to notice. What a neat trick! It doesn't work that way. The Japanese found this out in the 1970s and 80s. They had ample warnings from other countries. Other countries, again, who were not running export-based economies in the way that Japan was, that you're not going to do this indefinitely. And there's a point at which the Americans got fed up with it in the 1980s, and Japan really never really recovered from that. So that's really the way it worked. And Japan was in a stronger position. Japan's case was stronger than China's. I mean, Japan didn't have a per capita GDP number 75 in the world. Japan at least was a major economic power in the 1970s, and had a reasonably high standard of living. Not terribly, because Japan also pursued that policy of keeping consumption low, keeping standard of living low domestically, so they could export their products to the rest of the world. So yeah, nice try about with that China's the great winner. It just doesn't happen that way. It cannot happen that way. I mean, China just has too many economic problems to be the great economic winner. And Marx then says Trump and his family and friends have done $1 trillion deals in the Middle East, not for America, but for themselves. Many have links to Qatar, a state agent, Steve Witkoff, property company. Okay, I don't know. I mean, yeah. I mean, I guess if if there's anything untoward about it, then probably this will be investigated. I really don't care too much about whether the Trump family um, makes out like bandits or not. I mean, it's baked in. I mean, when Trump emerged as a figure on the political scenes, everybody knew who he was and what he was about. He's a real estate developer. He's always got his eye on the main chance. He's always trying to do deals. He's always trying to build Trump real estate somewhere or other. That's who he is. Um, and that's what you would expect. But he is bringing investment to the United States. I mean, I think clearly we'll have to see whether these investments materialize. I mean, at this stage, these are all promises, but at the same time, these are investments that will benefit the United States. How much he will get out of it, what his family will get out of it, we'll see. But I don't think people care that much. You see, the difference between Trump and other politicians is that Trump was already very rich when he launched his political career. In 2015, he was already a billionaire. So therefore, you say, well, whatever he makes, okay, that's maybe it's additional to that. But so far, the record is that Trump has lost money since starting his political career. I mean, he's lost money. I mean, he hasn't gained anything. So he's actually one of the few politicians who's actually poorer for having started a political career. I mean, the problems that arise with politicians and money is when politicians who start their careers as relatively poor men and women end up and finish their political careers when they're multimillionaires. And then they say, well, how did that come about? How did you started here? That's the thing with Biden. You started, you didn't have much money. Biden, he was not a terribly successful lawyer. And then suddenly he has all these big houses. He owns all this massive property. How did that come about? That's where you get a problem. Back in the day, Lyndon Johnson actually did start very poor, and then when he retires, he's fabulously wealthy. How did that come about? But with Trump, I mean, he started rich. He's not as rich now as he was when he started. Maybe he'll get richer as a result of his second term, but maybe he won't. There's a lot of things where we're only at the start of the his administration. We're going to have to see, how things develop. So, but no one's going to be very outraged about Trump's deals because it's baked in. It's kind of what you expect from Trump. I mean, the guy wrote the book, The Art of the Deal. I mean, that's what people expect from him. That's what he's about. He wants to make deals and to make money. Mark says, George, you were thinking, Marx, you were making a lot of comments, and that's fine. But you need to put things into the tip jar. I mean, that's kind of the way things work here. That's part of the sort of unwritten contract, the unwritten tacit rules. If you're going to make a number of comments and name observations, then you really need to put a little bit into the tip jar. That's the rules that the dogs have laid down. They're explicit about it. I try to be tacit and polite and so on, but the dogs aren't like that. They say, hey, you ask a question, you put money into the tip jar. You ask a second question, you put more money into the tip jar. That's the way it works. Now, I just say, well, these are unwritten. There's an unwritten code that if you make, you know, a number of comments and observations, often quite quite critical, should we say? Then you got to put something into the tip jar. But anyway, you were thinking Lavrov was showing up. Russia sent a strong military delegation. This will be resolved on the battlefield, and America, EU, UK can set whatever they want. I don't know whether it will or will not be solved on the battlefield. I think if it does get solved on the battlefield, then I think it would be a failure for Russia. I think Russia, has other fish to fry. I mean, as I was saying about this NATO-Russia Defense Council, um, clearly this is where Russia is heading. This is what Russia really wanted all along. And NATO has not addressed this issue. Biden did not address this issue. Blinken and Rishi Sunak, these names, I mean, and the rest of them, Macron, none of them addressed this issue. Trump has now started addressing this issue, knowing that this is the only way we're going to get anywhere on Ukraine. So therefore, there are ways that we can get around it other than the battlefield. If you go on the battlefield, then you have no real scope for diplomacy, and that means you're going to lose out on other things. Because let's remember, if it is indeed going to be resolved entirely on the battlefield, then NATO will just simply consolidate itself. NATO will boost its military spending. NATO will have more arms throughout Europe. No possibility of any kind of dialogue with Russia. Hostility between Russia and the West, in particular Russia and the United States. No arms control agreements, nothing for a generation. That would be the result if essentially all of this diplomacy fails, and it has to be, you have to go on the battlefield. Because remember, if the diplomacy fails, then the United States will just simply double down on Ukraine. Will just simply send more into Ukraine, and will just keep this war going. And that's not a good outcome. So we know what the issues that Russia wants addressed, and I think Trump is making this move now to begin to address them. So if it is going to be decided on the battlefield, then I think it will be a failure, and I think that would be it'd be a tragedy, because I think however many lives have already been lost, there's going to be a hell of a lot more lives lost. It's not going to end, if it's going to be decided on the battlefield, it's not going to end tomorrow, it's not going to end next week, it's not going to end next month. It won't even end the end of this year. It's going to go on. And that means more lives are going to be lost. And the final outcome will be like, two armed camps staring at each other, and none of Russia's security concerns will have been addressed. All that will have happened is Russia will have defeated Ukraine. But what about everything else? So, anyway. And then Judy, it was good to see you, Judy. Welcome. Always appreciate your comments and observations and thoughtful remarks. Thank you also for your generosity, Judy. And Judy says, George only read out my post that said Lavrov was going. I had read that in the Washington Post. George actually said he hadn't heard that himself. No, that's true. I did say that. I hadn't heard that myself. I mean, yeah. I mean, I thought, okay, maybe he's going to show up. I mean, I didn't want to rule it out, but I should have pointed out the Washington Post was the only source saying it. But even if George had said it himself, we all know how difficult it is to navigate all the media lives. Dare I say, you're doing a good bit of nitpicking. This is clearly addressed at Mark. So thank you very much for that, Judy. Yeah, I mean, I was prepared to think that maybe that's going to happen, that Lavrov will show up. I mean, once one really thought about it, it was very unlikely that Russia would at this early stage, um, have Lavrov there as foreign minister, because at this stage, really, all you need to ascertain, all you need at these negotiations is to determine whether your interlocutor is taking it seriously. Are they do they really want to use these talks to reach a negotiated outcome, or do they just want to do some grandstanding and use it as a PR stunt? So right at the beginning, it doesn't make sense to bring in a heavyweight like Lavrov. If it moves seriously, that's when you bring in Lavrov. But the fake news is, of course, absolutely right. I mean, we've been inundated with fake news and telling us this nonsense that somehow Russia was going to send Putin and whatever. I mean, it was all complete nonsense. and But this was done deliberately, and this didn't just come about. Um, that somehow that that well, we just made a mistake. This wasn't a mistake. This was done with a view to persuading Trump that somehow the Russians had promised that Putin would show up or Lavrov would show up, and then when Putin and Lavrov don't show up, hey, look, you were wrong to trust the Russians. You remember that was when that woman, Kristen Welker of Meet the Press, she said, "Oh, well, were you wrong to trust Putin?" That's what they want to do. You were wrong to trust Putin. So this is being done deliberately. This is being a deliberate falsehood is being presented. So that what Judy said of that in that Washington Post story, yeah, that's why they were saying, oh, Lavrov's going to show up. And then when, of course, Lavrov doesn't show up, they say, look, Lavrov isn't here. And then they kept repeating. You remember that, well, aren't you disappointed? What a low-level delegation. It's really a low-level delegation. That's a delegation the Russians promised. It's the same delegation that negotiated Istanbul. And Putin said, this is a continuation of the talks in Istanbul. So we're sending the same team that was in Istanbul. Everything was just made up. It was completely made up without any basis at all, in order to create this sense of disappointment. Oh, there's disappointment. CNN. Oh, look at this. Russia is giving us the runaround. This has been. They've been making all these promises, and now they're betraying their promises. They're not even showing up for this meeting. This meeting doesn't mean anything. The meeting means something. It's a meeting, to start negotiations. And Rubio said, okay, I mean, ultimately, there's not going to be any breakthrough without a one-on-one meeting between Putin and Trump. However, you can definitely have a serious negotiations and give indication, are you prepared to talk seriously? Because let's remember, the Istanbul talks were very serious, and they'd made a lot of progress. And they were very detailed, and they made a great deal of progress, particularly on the issue of NATO membership, on the issue of reduction of Ukrainian armed forces. So that's what the Russians are saying. We got to, we can make progress at a low level. You don't need to have Lavrov here or anything else. Anyway, thank you very much, Judy. Mark says, wrongly, he was telling Peter Lavrov would be there due to the fact the U.S. delegation would be attending, one being Rubio. What I said to Peter was that there was a possibility that Lavrov was there, but then, as we discussed it, first of all, I didn't say Lavrov would be there. I said there's a possibility that Lavrov would be there. given that Rubio was going to show up, and given that if Rubio wanted to have a one-on-one meeting with Lavrov as a possibility. However, if you follow that discussion, I was actually persuaded and thinking that no, I don't think Lavrov would show up because because I just didn't think there was any justification at this stage before there's any determination on the Russians' part that the Ukrainians are going to negotiate seriously, that this isn't going to just be anything other than a public relations stunt, then I don't think there's any reason for Lavrov to show up. So yeah, that was anyway. Dennis Judy says these are huge developments George is presenting. Yeah, I mean these are enormously consequential because what we're talking about here is that for the first time since 2021, the United States is beginning to address seriously Russia's concerns, Russia's security concerns, those security concerns that the Biden administration had discounted, that NATO has repeatedly discounted, and now suddenly the Trump administration is taking them seriously, going against the wishes of NATO. This is NATO has been dead set against this. Going, well, you know, this is from 2014. Is now they're going against the will of NATO. So this is very these are major developments. And then these comments today from Trump and then by Rubio about this one-on-one meeting. Well, this is this is serious stuff. Anyway, and then Dennis Misty says Trump is becoming presidential. I think I agree. I agree. This is, you know, he didn't do this during his first term. I think he during his first term, he was just, I don't know, seemed to just be quite happy to just go along with the Washington consensus. He hired all these people like Rex Tillerson, Mike Pompeo, John Bolton. But and just allowed them to do their thing. You know, just these conventional Washington types. He's not doing that now. He's taking charge of foreign policy, and he's kind of making clear what he wants. I mean, he wants this war to end. It's no question. He wants this war to end. He's just trying to find a way to do it. And you know, and ultimately, if you really are determined to want to end it, he will find a way to end it. I mean, you just have to, you know, if you want to end this, if you're determined to end it, he will find a way to end it. It's clear that he's doing one thing, another thing, and he's trying different things, and that's why I've always cited the analogy of Richard Nixon in 1969. You know, and they were, oh, you know, it's Nixon's war. Nixon hasn't, you know, Nixon's not doing anything. Oh, you know, Nixon should have just withdrawn. You know, January 20th, 1969, should have just pulled all the American forces out. Never happens that way. You don't just do something overnight. That's just not the way the world works. It's not the way a great power works. It's not even the way a small power works. Everything takes time to do. And during those years, 69 to 73, Nixon tried one thing and another thing and then a third thing, and then all the time. You know, he tried the Paris peace talks. He tried to go to the Soviet Union. He tried to influence with China. He tried the incursion into Cambodia. He tried Laos. You know, he tried the Vietnamization policy. You know, the bombing of the North. He tried one thing after another. Eventually, he got there. But you know, you don't get there just, you know, in a couple of hours and as if it's some you know, so simple thing like, what are we going to cook for dinner tonight? I mean, that's just not the way it works. Anyway, Robert, always good to see you, Robert. Thank you so much. You know, New Jersey Um, so it's a really nice state. I remember spending times in New Jersey, and I don't mean just Atlantic City, even though Atlantic City is was quite fun. But other parts of New Jersey are also a lot of fun. Anyway, Robert says, "Thank you, George, for another great book pick." That was Gabriel Kolko's "The Politics of War." Thank you. I'm glad you liked it. And Murray Rothbard built on Kolko's revisionist history approach, to Kolko's chagrin, to make the case that big business often uses government to block competition, which includes tariffs. Both saw tariffs not as protection for workers or consumers, but as tools for established firms to shut out rivals. As with regulation, they argue that tariffs help big players stay dominant at the expense of consumers and startups. Well, I guess that's a possibility. But I mean, tariffs at the same time protect um, domestic industries, and therefore they do protect workers. They protect jobs. Um, I mean, you're right in general. Yes, that it can stifle competition. But on the other hand, it can also protect domestic industries against foreign competition that is itself often the result of unfair trading practices. Because, I mean, it's all very well to have this free market idea, deregulation, and free trade, and so on. But what if somebody else is essentially subsidizing his exports? What if somebody else is manipulating currency? What if somebody else is actually stealing intellectual property, or somebody else is is closing his market off against your product? Then you don't really have free trade anymore, and therefore in the name of um, defending the sort of the anti-monopolies, your own industries are getting wiped out by unfair competition. So yes, it's undesirable to have monopolies, but we have this all the time. I don't think this isn't a matter of tariffs. I mean, we've seen how uncompetitive um, key industries are, and that has nothing to do with tariffs. I mean, that's just in the nature of the beast. When you have powerful, um, industries, they do indeed stifle competition. I mean, we saw what happened with Microsoft. You know what Microsoft did. Now we've seen what Google does. We've seen what Facebook does. I mean, so this has nothing to do with tariffs. These are just powerful um, industries, and they are strong enough to stifle competition. So in principle, yeah, anti-competitive practices are a bad thing. I think government should try to stifle and things that are anti-competitive, because it's a way of just uh, keeping everybody else out of these industries. But I don't think tariffs are really has anything to do with that. I think tariffs have their own um, uh, rationale, and I think there's a very good rationale for it when you realize that your competitors around the world are not playing by the same rules, and that your competitors are actually strategizing how they can enter your market and wipe out the competition, through all sorts of unfair practices. And we've had this time and time again, and Americans have suffered for it. Americans have practiced free trade. Americans have essentially been the open market of last resort. It's like you know, every other country tries to export their way out of trouble, economic problems, and well, where do they export to? Because basically, if everybody's exporting, somebody has to do the importing. So Germany's exporting, Japan's exporting, China's exporting, everybody's exporting. Well, who's going to import? Well, it's the United States. And the United States said, okay, we'll be the importer of last resort. And then, of course, it has the consequences. One American industry after another gets wiped out. And at some point, and we've known this for a long time, at some point, the Americans are going to get fed up with it. It's just taken a long time. But Ross Perot brought this up in 1992. Pat Buchanan also brought this up in 1992, which is, hey, we practice free trade, again, and then we're getting wiped. Our clock is getting cleaned by countries that don't practice free trade, that are just using our open markets to wipe out our industries. So that's why. I mean, I understand the argument, the libertarian argument against tariffs, but in practical terms, this libertarianism can be used essentially to destroy your own economy. Now there are people, the free market, free absolutists, to say, well, it doesn't matter. We have this wonderful global economy, and from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. So we don't have this, and then we'll do something else, and somebody else will do something else, and so on. And everything's great, but that doesn't really work. You ultimately need fundamental industries to be a serious economic power. You need an auto industry, you need an aerospace industry, you need a pharmaceutical industry, you need a strong extraction industry. You need all of that. You can't just simply, have others providing these things for you. We saw that during COVID, that America had allowed itself to become vulnerable to others, particularly China, controlling the supply chain. So I'm I'm not persuaded by free markets. Having said that, I think Murray Rothbard was an interesting writer. I do enjoy his writings. So anyway, thank you very much, Robert. Um, um, okay. Uh, um, uh, here we have. We go back. Where were we? Yeah. So Judy then points out. Let's go. Judy says. The task coverage of the NATO-Russia Council revival includes this history. Okay, in 2021, Russia put forward an initiative to sign a security guarantee agreement with the bloc. Yeah, those are the two draft agreements by Putin. In it, Moscow suggested that NATO not view Russia as an adversary, exercise restraint in holding military exercises in border areas, refrain from military activity in Eastern Europe, Transcaucasia, Central Asia, and guarantee that it would not expand eastward. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That was in the those agreements that the Biden administration blithely ignored. So the Russians presented these two draft agreements, and the Biden administration and NATO did not even deign to respond. They didn't come up with any kind of a written response. Nothing. They didn't put forward an idea. Okay, well, let's have a global conference where some of these issues can be thrashed out. Nothing. There was absolutely nothing there. So it was that response, or lack of response, from the Biden administration that guaranteed war, because it was clear from everything that Putin had been saying in November and December 2021 that the Russians were really quite serious with NATO. I mean, this was what NATO had been doing was just simply becoming intolerable to Russia, and therefore you couldn't just ignore these draft agreements. Remember, I mean, Russians had never done this before. The Russians hadn't just presented these kinds of draft treaties before. So this was very serious, and the for NATO and the Biden administration simply not to even respond to it, not to present a written response, not to agree to hold a conference, guaranteed war. And I think that's where the difference lies between Biden and Trump, because I think if this had happened when Trump was president, I think Trump would have taken it seriously. Trump would have taken these draft agreements seriously, and I think he would have presented a response, whether it's a written response or an invitation for a kind of a global conference. But he would have taken it seriously. And I think not to take something seriously was almost criminally irresponsible. Um, you know, anybody could have seen that this is something really extraordinary on the Russians' part. They'd never done this before. So if now they've done this, you're going to have to take this seriously, and they didn't. And so now but this NATO-Russia Council, this hasn't been operating since 2014. So it's very interesting that the United States has now revived this. It's interesting at at what level this issue came up. It's quite possible that Putin had put this forward to Steve Witkoff. Maybe Lavrov had pointed this out during his talks with Rubio, but now this is on the agenda, and this presents a possible path forward. May not. The things. There's an awful lot of things that can go wrong, but it's a possible way forward. Anyway, thank you very much, Judy. Anne Marie, always very good to see you, Anne Marie. And Anne Marie is our resident musical expert, and all of her contributions, her thoughtful observations, and her recollections of personal experiences with working with conductors and composers are always really, really interesting. And I think we at the Gaggle are very fortunate to be the recipients of her recollections. So thank you, Anne Marie, as always. Really appreciate it. And again, thank you for your generous contribution. So here we have anyway. Judy says, for example, NBC idiotic headline: Putin skips out on the direct Ukraine peace talks that he suggested. Yeah, that's exactly it. That's you encapsulated what I was saying perfectly. That's it. Putin skips out on the direct Ukraine peace talks that he suggested. He never suggested. I mean, I don't have to repeat this. Never suggested that he personally would attend. And it just, common sense it tells you heads of state do not show up at the very earliest stages of peace talks. It's never happened. Never happened in any peace negotiations. The heads of state only show up at the very end when you're signing the final agreements. And it's just like when you have arms control agreements, you have years of negotiations of arms control agreements, at fairly low, middling level. But the final agreements, they're the ones that are signed by the heads of state. You don't step in and have Putin and Zelensky. Of course, the plan always was that, Putin's going to show up in Istanbul, and then Zelensky is going to start yelling at him, and then have all the cameras there, and they'll all be everyone will be screaming at Putin, and this would be a great public relations stunt. Everybody would really have a good time. Now, what is so remarkable about this scenario, because that was the idea that, Putin was going to show up, and so everyone's going to just have a great time yelling at him. What was remarkable about that is that they thought that Russians are going to be that stupid to fall into this trap. I mean, you really thought that Putin would allow himself to be ambushed in this way? I mean, it's stupid. I mean, it's an insult to people's intelligence. But that's what the media have done, and the media have deliberately pretended to be really stupid. And with this story, Putin skips out. He skips out on the direct Ukraine peace talks that he suggested. I mean, a total lie, absolute lie, complete, utter fraud. Anyway, so, and then Dennis Misty. All right, thank you very much, Dennis. Really appreciate your generosity. To repeat a comment from the previous stream in the Netflix series One of the President, they had 50 scriptwriters. In this series, too, they are letting the leading actor improvise. Okay. The Netflix series One of the President, they had a 50 scriptwriter. In the series 2, they're letting leading actor improvise. Okay. That's very interesting. And then Robert says, I used ChatGPT to get the gist of the Helsinki Conference of 1975. ChatGPT said that the human rights came to the fore for the first time in Helsinki. Was this strategic on the part of the West to gain leverage, to have a club with which to brandish against competitors and adversaries, particularly the USSR? Also, could you argue that the seats of the ICC had to be found in Helsinki? I wouldn't have said that. I mean, the human rights component was definitely there in 1975, but I don't think the Russians thought that was so important. I mean, what mattered to the Russians was that essentially that everybody accepted the World War II settlement, the borders that were drawn up after World War II, the regimes that was established after World War II. Everybody declared this is permanent. Nobody's going to have any irredentist aspirations. The Germans accept that their country is divided, and all talk of German reunification is simply, put into abeyance for generations. I mean, in other words, you have to now accept, after all the talk that had been going on since starting from in the 1950s and 1960s, that somehow West Germany is the one and only government of Germany. East Germany has no legitimacy and whatever. All that is gone. Everybody accepts that there are now two German governments. There are two Germanys. The two Germanys can certainly have diplomatic relations or whatever, economic relations or so on. But all talk of German reunification under West German or NATO auspices was off the table. And the in any attempt to undercut the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, that also was off the table. And so I think that was what the Soviets thought at Helsinki. That's what that mattered to them. The human rights component, I think, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, but I also thought that they regarded that as secondary, because there was nothing in that human rights basket that wasn't already in the various international agreements and covenants that had already been signed. I mean, after all, there was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that goes back to 1948, and the Soviet Union signed that. And human rights, the human rights component was also, it's in the Charter of the United Nations. Not as explicit as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but nonetheless, it was in the in that in the Charter about the need to observe human rights, and so I don't think they thought this was that the Soviet Union was really signing on to anything more than it had signed on to with in 1948 with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, the Western powers, they did talk about human rights, but it didn't necessarily mean all that much, because that's in 1975. Now, the Western powers had been talking about human rights for some years, and what the Soviet Union had done, so that's 1975, but in the years before, the Soviet Union had been really dealing with its dissident problem by essentially kicking out people from the country. So, back in the Stalin era, there was the Gulag, there was executions, but the Soviet leaders had come up with a new solution, which was that they just throw people out. Now, Solzhenitsyn, he was thrown out. I think it was 1974. Yeah, 1974 that he was gone, and then some other dissidents also were kicked out of the country. And then, of course, what the Soviet Union had done is they allowed the emigration of the Jews. The Americans had made it a big issue, again, starting around 1970, that the Soviet Union needs to allow the Jews to leave. And the Soviet Union had done that. I mean, they had to pay a stiff exit tax, and it wasn't that easy. There was the whole process wasn't entirely easy, but nonetheless, the Soviet Union had agreed to this, and they figured that they can export their problems onto someone else, and that wasn't wholly a wrong diagnosis on their part, because Solzhenitsyn, he came out, he came to the West, and he was immediately celebrated. Oh, one of the great author, everyone thought, oh, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, Cancer Ward, great man, great writer. Everybody was slobbering over him, and then he kind of grew very quickly disenchanted with the United States, and then he delivered a speech at Harvard. I can't remember what year that was. The famous speech at Harvard, when he basically said, "I don't think much of the United States," and basically he then said, "Well, I don't think much of the West in general," and that became his creed for the many years that he lived in the West, from about 1975 through to 1974 through to about 1991, 1992, when he went back. He said he was going to go back once the communists were gone. He was going to go back, and he did go back. So in a way, it wasn't wholly wrong. And of course, the um, the the Jews, they were always going to be a problem wherever they went. I mean, they were particularly. I mean, if the Jews go to Israel, that's going to be a problem for someone else, namely the Palestinians. But if the Jews go to the United States, they're going to create problems for the U.S. government. And I think that that's how they figured. They thought that this wouldn't really be too much of a problem, with the various dissidents. I think that by the mid 1970s, the Soviet Union, the communists in general, had figured that they can deal with the dissident problem, because they figured that the dissidents were really a kind of a small minority. They didn't really have any support, a wider support in the public, the support among the masses. That in the West was always inordinately fascinated by the dissidents, constantly writing articles, this or that writer in the Soviet Union and so on. But they didn't really have any wide following in their own countries. They weren't like the Bolsheviks. I mean, the Bolsheviks had moved in among the masses and started organizing among the masses, among the proletariat, and therefore they were dangerous. And the Soviets just figured that they're not really dangerous; they can just deal with this problem. So, just to answer your question about the human rights component, I don't think the Soviets were too worried about that, and I don't think the reason for the final collapse of the Soviet Union and communism had anything to do with the human rights element to it. I mean, I think what the Soviets wanted was this mutual recognition that the division of World War II is here to stay. It's permanent. There's no one's going to try and push us out. No one's going to start getting agitated about the communist regime in Poland or whatever. That's it. It's here to stay, and you just mind your own business, and we'll mind ours. Now, the ICC, I don't think that's where its origins are. I think the ICC came about following the end of the Cold War, and that once the Cold War had come to an end. See, remember, there were the war crimes trials that took place in the immediate aftermath of World War II. There was the big Nuremberg trial that everybody remembers, with Goering and Keitel and Jodl and so on. But there were other trials. There was the doctor's trial. There was the trial of the judges. And then there were various, there was the Auschwitz trial, the Treblinka trial. So, but the kind of what was distinctive about Nuremberg is that everybody was on board. All the allies were on board. Once the Cold War started, then there was really no longer any cooperation between the Soviet Union and the Western powers. And so essentially these trials really more or less came to an end. I mean, the Auschwitz trial and the Treblinka trial, these were internal German affairs. But when the Cold War came to an end, they thought, hey, well, why don't we go back to this practice of putting people on trial? Because this is you have this liberals who always want to put somebody on trial. They always are looking for some mechanism to accuse someone, find them morally reprehensible, moral reprobates, and throw them in prison. And so initially, I mean, it really almost almost the very moment the Cold War came to an end, Then they created the first of these international tribunals, which was I mean, first of all, they wanted to put Saddam Hussein on trial. That was quite close. I mean, after Gulf War One, so that was Gulf War One came to an end in 1991, and already then the Americans wanted to put Saddam Hussein on trial. That didn't happen. But in 1993 they did this. They set up the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and and obviously that was the Americans were pushing for this under Madeleine Albright and the Clinton administration, and the hapless and foolish Russians agreed to it at the UN Security Council. So they set up the ICTY, and then Boutros Ghali, who wasn't too happy about this because he felt, yeah, well, why are we so preoccupied with what's going on in Yugoslavia? What about all the other crises around the world? So Boutros Ghali kind of pushed the UN Security Council to set up a similar tribunal for Rwanda in 1994. So the ICC is continuing the work of these tribunals. Hey, what a neat idea to put others on trial. We'll set up a base in The Hague. That's where all the international courts are, and then we can shove people in prison. And so I think that was the origin of it. But the ICC's problem is that, unlike the ICTY and the ICTR, the Rwanda Tribunal, ICC wasn't really set up by the UN Security Council. I mean, as I say, it was a catastrophe of the Yeltsin regime to have allowed this, but nonetheless, the Yugoslav Tribunal was set up by the UN Security Council, which made it very difficult to do anything about, because then it had the imprimatur of the UN Security Council. And the Russians, who set a great store by the UN Security Council, they had to go along with this Yugoslav tribunal that was obviously targeting the Serbs, the Russians' great allies. So, that just shows the sort of the foolishness and irresponsibility of the Russians in agreeing to this. But the ICC doesn't have any connection with the United Nations. It's like a free floating thing. Now, all the kind of international lawyers, all the smarmy, well-paid lawyers, love the ICC because they can make a lot of money working at the ICC, and particularly working as prosecutors. They all want to just be prosecutors. They're not interested in being defense counsel. But it's part of the reputation that they build up, these big law firms, that, oh, well, I worked at the ICC. I spent 2 years at the ICC. Like this guy, Jack Smith, the prosecutor who went after Trump. Oh, we spent time at the ICC. That gives you this credibility. And then you have the Human Rights Brigade, who say, oh, he obviously cares about human rights. He doesn't care about human rights whatsoever. He certainly doesn't care about the human rights of the defendants of the ICC. It's merely a political weapon. So yeah, I mean, it is, of course, human rights is like a political weapon. But I think the ICC is it's very much a product of the post-Cold War world, where you said, hey, we can bring back the good old days of putting people on trial. There's great images. You remember when all those defendants were sitting there in the dark, and then, of course, when Israel put Eichmann on trial, there he is in a glass booth. This is what they said. Oh, this is fantastic. We want to see people behind the glass booth. All the people we don't like should be sitting behind the glass booth. And that. I think that's the impetus behind the ICC. And they would love to see Trump. What most of all is to see Trump behind the glass booth, head hanging down, knowing these righteous words of prosecuting attorneys ringing in his ears. So I think that's the ICC. Anyway, thank you, Robert. Marty, always very good to see you. Marty, thank you so much, as always, for your generosity. Thank you so much for all your contribution. Really, really appreciate it. That's thank you very much. I think that we've covered a lot of ground here. Thank you, everybody who was. Somebody says, "What is a gaggler?" A gaggler is somebody who's a member of the Gaggle locals community. So if you join, please join. Ideally you'll contribute. Then ideally you contribute, and that keeps the dogs happy. And if the dog's happy, then they leave me alone. If they're not happy, then life becomes very hard for me. So if you can contribute something, that would be good, and then you'll get to be a gaggler. But just join the gaggle.locals.com, and we would really appreciate it. So thank you, everybody, for joining me. We'll do some podcasts over the weekend, and then we're going to do the live stream with Peter on Monday morning, East Coast time, and then I'm going to do my solo on next Tuesday. So thank you, everybody, and look forward to seeing you all very soon. Thank you. Good night. All the best. Bye-bye.